The main point of discussion now is if the uprisings in the Arab world are anti-capitalist or potentially anti-capitalist. And maybe we could first start with David Harvey, because we mentioned your country of origin, of course, and Samir Amin said it's not the president, but the...
Yeah, so I hope you all agree that some of your very best friends are American. Thank you. Well, you don't know, do you? Yeah, I don't know very much about North Africa, and so I can't really talk very knowledgeably about what's going on. And I'm a geographer, and one of the things we tell geographers, if you go to a country for one day, you write a book about it. If you go for 3 weeks, you write an article about it. If you stay for 3 years, you don't write anything. Which tells you that actually things are always extremely complicated on the ground. And one of the things I always try not to do is to pontificate about something I really don't know anything about. One of the things, though, that I would want to point out, and here I agree with Samir, that actually this Arab Spring comes in the midst of a whole sequence of events. I actually would prefer not to call it the Arab Spring. I think I would like to use a phrase that I think our old friend Giovanni Arrighi would like, which is to say, let's call it the autumn of capital. We agree? Oh, jeez. This is getting bad. We might have unity up here, and then what we're left to do. So, I think that when you look at the pattern over the last 30 or 40 years, I think that it's been fairly clear that it's been extremely difficult for capital to find productive outlets for the surpluses it generates. And there is therefore what I call a capital surplus absorption problem. And one of the things that I have noted is that actually less and less capital goes into productive work. More and more of it goes into either speculative assets and so on, which has now led to all of this land grab, resource grab stuff which is going on in Africa and elsewhere. It's also leading to a kind of a rentier capitalism, in which intellectual property rights and control of those, and you just live off the rents kind of thing, has also become very significant. But the other thing that's happened is that there's been a lot of what I call accumulation by dispossession. And there's been a fierce attack upon what remains of the global peasantry, a fierce attack upon low-income populations, even inside of the United States. What we're seeing is a savaging of vulnerable populations. And as that goes on, you see immense accumulations of wealth. India, I think, is a very good example of this. India is growing very quickly right now. All the data, everybody says, oh, India may catch China, it's growing at 7 or 8%. I talk to my Indian colleagues and they say, well, that's making no difference whatsoever. In fact, what's happening is that indigenous populations and peasant populations are being forced off the land, they're being pushed around. But the other piece of data is that 3 years ago in India there were 26 billionaires and there are now 69. And the same is true in China. You see what happened in Mexico after neoliberalization. Now the richest person in the world is Carlos Slim, who's a Mexican. And Mexico has more billionaires than Saudi Arabia, an extremely impoverished country. So what we've seen, in fact, is an immense concentration and centralization of wealth in what, in effect, is a global plutocracy. And this global plutocracy governs in a variety of ways, and I think what we saw, the kind of government structures in places like Egypt, is a sort of autocratic form of government in which the military can suck much of the wealth out as part of the business class in the way that it was doing. And as it sucked it out, and also as it started to collar more and more in the way of resources, what we see is rising prices. And one thing I do about North Africa is there's been a long history of food riots over the last 20 or 30 years, and I can't imagine that somehow or other the rising price of food and bread and basics in Egypt didn't have something to do with the fact that it gained so quickly a very populist base, that something had to be done economically for daily life in that part of the world. But this is going on almost everywhere. And I think you're seeing, therefore, political responses to these objective conditions. And I think you said something terribly important, which is that objective conditions change, but if subjective understandings don't change, then you get kind of incoherent movements which are extremely hard to shape in a socialist direction. They can end up grounded in neo-fascist, right-wing nonsense. I mean, we see that in the United States right now. And of course, in places like Hungary, and you know, I don't have to tell you folk about that around here, right? I mean, it's just absolutely a dangerous situation for that very reason. And I think this is something that we collectively need to do something about. And much as I respect my two colleagues up here shouting at each other, frankly, I don't think it helps. I really don't think it helps. There's a much bigger job to be done over whether you're right about this. And, you know, I know Slavoj loves to get blood on the floor, but you know.
You like the blood on the floor.
If you want,
you like the blood on the floor.
Yeah, so if you want blood on the floor, go and bloody some of those, you know, bureau plutocrats, you know. So you know, this it seems to me is the global political situation. And as I see it, capital has not solved its problems at all. Right now you have a division in the world, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, between kind of an austerity monetarist mania in North America and Europe, which is actually about driving the standard of living of the mass of the people into the ground in order to sort of suck up the wealth for the bankers and the plutocrats. And you have a Keynesian expansionist program, which is centered on China, which is also entraining all of those countries that feed into the China trade. So if you look at Australia or you look at Chile, who are providing raw materials to China, they're booming along quite well. And actually much of Latin America is, because it's reoriented its trade to China. So you see this kind of distinctive kind of thing going on in the world, but that doesn't actually solve the problem. And my view of it is that the problem that has been there for us plain to see over the last 30 years is going to continue to be here. And in the same way that we look at what's happening now and sort of think it's something new, and you look back to Indonesia and say, yeah, what had happened back there? And the same thing is true of this financial crisis. You look at the financial crisis back then, and you look what happened in Argentina, and you look what happened, you know, even in the United States in the late 1980s with the savings and loan kind of crash and all the rest of it. So this has been very volatile. And this means that there's a very, very clear thing for the left to do, both in specific situations, such as that of Egypt, but I think also in more general situations, which is that the left has to start actually paying attention to trying to change the subjective understandings and the political subjectivity that exists around the world. And that seems to me to be one of the things that I would like to put on the table. Thanks.
Before some blood on the table.